Okay, this is a quick video on evolution. So Darwin's theory of evolution is the theory that organisms are driven by the need to survive and replicate. Essentially, that's all it boils down to survival and replication. Survival and replication. However, I believe that it's evident everywhere that evolution and change is not driven by survival and replication, or is not driven by this, or not driven primarily by this instinctual will to survive, this will to life, and this will to continue the species. This view on evolution doesn't seem to make much sense when we look at how organisms actually act in their surroundings. Now, what I propose as a better and alternative explanation is Nietzsche's will to power. Now, Nietzsche states that this will to power is the dominant principle in organic function and behaviour, and not the will for self-preservation and reproduction. Now, put simply, the will to power is strength overcoming weakness, overcoming resistance, domination and control of the environment. It's the will to exert influence over ourselves and also over our surroundings. It's the desire that we have for creative expression and the desire for the enhancement of the organism or being in question. Sometimes this can even come at the expense of the organism itself, i.e. sometimes the organism can actually lose its life while in the pursuit of its will to power. So for Nietzsche, all evolution is driven by this will to power. The weak perish at the expense of the strong, which is the similar view to Darwin's notion of the survival of the fittest, or more accurately, he says the evolution is the survival of those which are most susceptible to change. So instead of this change being driven by the need for survival and replication, is instead driven by the desire for the strong to overcome the weak, and for the being to exert its power and influence over its environment and surroundings. Now, we can also assume that evolution is not driven by the pursuit of pleasure either, as it's quite evident that people will go to great lengths to harm themselves and others in order to obtain something other than happiness, which is, for example, suicide bombers or martyrs. So clearly it makes no sense for someone to kill themselves and other people if it does not bring about more happiness, or and this type of behaviour cannot be described in terms of a will to self-preservation or propagation of the species, or self-replication. It's a sacrifice that is offered for our own desire for power. So people will quite often in these situations sacrifice themselves for the attainment of something higher, the attainment of power or control over their surroundings. I'm aware that quite a few evolutionary biologists would claim to easily account for suicide by arguing that the individual is thinking about the survival of his species when he commits suicide. They might choose to end their life out of guilt, by reducing the shame brought on their loved ones by removing themselves from the gene pool. Or they equally might view themselves as some sort of burden on their fellow species for whatever reason, maybe due to depression or something, and so voluntarily choose to remove themselves for what they view to be the benefit of the species. Now, as for suicide bombers, I think it's pretty clear that their actions are driven by striving for something other than life, by striving for power, even if it is absurd, as the power game will end once they're dead. So we might think, well, why? What's the point? What's the purpose of doing it? So I'm not quite sure how a biologist would account for suicide bombers in this situation, or how they would describe suicide bombers from the standard evolutionary perspective. So the will to power here can then be seen as like an engine which drives all organisms and has no end goal in itself. The purpose of the living is not to continue their being and to survive. Instead, the purpose of life is to project one's power onto its surroundings and to consume as much as possible to try and overcome any resistance and expand itself as well as its territory. So in this sense, we're no different to bacteria or cancer, really, in the sense that we, like all other living organisms on this planet, have this will to power where we just want to, like bacteria, we just want to spread and just take over everything. We just want to dominate our surroundings and our environment and be in control of our environment. So Nietzsche would argue that Darwin's theory of natural selection is a mechanistic theory, as it can only describe behaviour in terms of a reaction to the environment. For example, the The environment requires a certain function to exist in order for the being to survive. So that particular being then reacts to that situation by evolving a certain organ or a certain genetic characteristic or something, which then enables it to survive and flourish in that particular environment. Whereas Nietzsche's will to power explains how organisms can actively affect their environment as well as react to it. So Darwin's theory cannot explain why an action occurs, it can only explain how an action occurs. So to use another example, if we were to look at a plant, we will see that it does so much more than is necessary for its own preservation and its own survival. It could live happily in a plant pot, sustaining itself and only using the energy it needs to survive, whilst at the same time conserving any excess energy around it that it doesn't need in order to ensure that it lives for as long as possible. But it doesn't. A plant will continue to absorb more sunlight, it will continue to absorb more nutrients, continue to absorb more water in order to grow bigger and bigger in an effort to gain superiority over its environment and to exert its strength and dominance. You know, the plant will strive to grow, it strives to overcome, it strives to expand itself more and more, to get bigger and bigger, and only as a result of this, the plant then ensures its own survival. So we can see how the will to power is the dominant drive over any other type of will to self-preservation or will to life, which means that survival and replication can only be viewed as a subsidiary of the will to power. That is, the will to power is the single dominant drive in all living things, and survival and replication is only a byproduct of the organism's striving for dominance.